Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to be building this multi-purpose standing desk which has integrated lighting, tons of customizable storage, cable management and a bunch of other features, and of course it's height adjustable, so stick around if you want to see more. Some of you might have seen the desk that I built about 2 years ago, which is somewhat similar to this one, and one of the most common things that popped up in the comments there was people saying that I should make it height adjustable. So with this new build I'm finally adding that feature thanks to FlexiSpot, who sent me one of their standing desk frames, which I decided to deck out with similar features, so let's take a look at the design real quick. Like last time, this concept is based around adding a back wall to the desk, which has an integrated shelf that also doubles as a light source because it has an LED strip with the cables neatly hidden inside the frame. Since I wanted this to be independent from the actual desk, the whole shelf unit is not part of the table base, but actually attaches to the underside of the tabletop, and that makes it possible to add one of these to almost any desk out there. Since I'm planning to use this in my workshop, the entire back wall will be made up of a Pegboard system this time, which will provide storage for tools and materials and enable me to use this as a workstation for various tasks on top of being a computer desk. This desk also has a brand new feature, which is a huge custom drawer underneath the tabletop that can be used to store a ton of small parts or office supplies. I'm going to show you those and some more features at the end, so let's jump into the build for now, which for me started with unpacking these Pegboard panels. You can find tons of different Pegboard systems online, and I went with this one for two reasons. First of all, I like the clean look and the glossy finish, but they also happen to be the perfect size for this particular tabletop size. Like most stuff I buy, I found these on eBay from some brand nobody's ever heard of, so I can't guarantee the exact same ones are going to be available in your country, but you can find many similar ones on Amazon, for example, and actually IKEA sells a popular Pegboard system too. The frame for the shelf unit is made from 25mm steel tubing, which is handy because that's almost the same as 1 inch. And speaking of measurements, I actually made 3 sets of plans for this build. One is for the exact desk you're seeing in the video, and then I also designed a version for a larger tabletop, which is also optimized so that it fits the IKEA Pegboard panels I just mentioned, because I figured those will be available almost anywhere. This version of the plans comes in both imperial and metric, and I also included a bunch of info on how to customize measurements for different size tabletops, so if you're interested in that, you can find those in the description. Let's get back to the build. As always, the first step is to cut all the pieces of tubing to length, and I also get a bunch of 45-degree miters. Since I want the panels to fit in there perfectly, I'm aligning the frame around those, and I feel like I need to mention once again that even though I'm using a very fancy welding table, it's by no means necessary to build this kind of thing. It just makes it a lot more convenient, but you could basically weld this whole thing up by just using a bench vise and some welding magnets or some other way of holding things at a right angle. To attach the panels, I'm using some strips of flat bar, and that's because these panels are steel, so I can actually tack weld them onto the frame. But in the plans, this is actually designed with a piece of angle iron on the bottom instead, which would allow you to put something like wooden panels into the frame and attaching them with screws. Now that I know this all fits together, I can clamp this down and then start placing a bunch of tack welds. In the last video, a lot of people complained about the welding light blinding them. I can't say it's ever been an issue for me personally, but I decided to listen to your feedback. So I'm playing around with the new welding filter during editing here, which hopefully makes things easier on the eyes if you have a bright screen. So feel free to let me know in the comments if this is an improvement. Before I do full welds, I'm removing the panels again, because I don't want to burn the paint on those. And now I can start to run a few beads. These shots here are actually filmed through a welding helmet, so this is closer to what I'm actually seeing during welding, but they're pretty time consuming to set up, which is why I'm not doing it like this all the time. Welding is really difficult to film, not just because of the brightness, but also because the area where the interesting stuff happens is about as big as your small fingernail, so it's hard to capture that in detail without the camera interfering with the actual work or vice versa. This goes even more for TIG welding, which is what this process is called, as opposed to something like MIG welding where you don't need to use both hands. Now I'm grinding the welds flat, and besides making things look a bit cleaner, I'm also doing this because there will be additional pieces attached here, so I need a flat surface for that. And speaking of a flat surface, you see a lot of people gouging the material when they try to grind welds and leaving a pretty ugly uneven finish. And I think besides impatience, the main reason for this is relying on the flap disc too much. Flap discs can remove a lot of material, but ideally you only use those to knock off the high spots, and then switch to something like this flat grinding disc attachment, which is much better for actually producing a flat surface. And once you're done with that, you can even go the extra mile and use an orbital sander, This doesn't take off much material, but it can hide the grinding marks from the previous steps and produces a much more uniform finish, which also provides a good base for paint to stick to. Now the panels can go back in, but before I did that I removed the paint in some of those places where I want to place tack welds. There's still going to be a little bit of smoke though, so I'm running the fume extraction here. Now I can release the fixtures again and the back panel is now in one piece. And as you can see, the paint in front still looks fine. Next step is to weld on these pieces that will attach the shelf unit to the tabletop. So I'm getting out these huge angle fixtures here. This is absolute overkill for what I'm building here, but since I have them, I might as well use them. And this allows me to set up the back panel in an upright position. Before I attach those parts, I'm just going to drill some mounting holes first, because it's much easier than doing it by hand when it's all in one piece. And now I can align this using this small angle and clamp it. I'm flipping this over because I want to do the outside corner welds first, since those don't pull as much as the others. Outside corner welds are always kind of tricky to weld, especially if you're going vertical, so I always try to set up my parts so that I can at least do them horizontally, where gravity doesn't affect the weld puddle as much. Next I'm doing the inside corner joint. This joint usually pulls the most, but I'm expecting that I have to align these later anyway, because even with the fixturing setup, there will always be some amount of welding distortion, especially when you have a long piece like this that's kind of floating there, just attached to one side. As expected, these parts lifted up a little bit towards the end due to the inside corner pulling them up, but we can easily fix that. I'm just going to place some spacers under the other end, and now I can use a clamp to push one end down and bend them back. And since steel has a lot of flex to it, I need to bend them quite a bit further so that it springs back to the point where I actually want it to end up. And now after a bit of back and forth, these are reasonably close to square. Next up are these two pieces that will hold up the shelf. But before I weld those on, I'm drilling some holes for the integrated cable for the light that's going to come out the corner here. The second hole is on the bottom corner, so that's going to come out underneath the tabletop. And now I'm inserting a steel cable as a placeholder, which will later be replaced with the electrical cable. And now it's time for some more welding. In retrospect, it would have been much smarter to attach these pieces before attaching the back panels, because I had to be very careful here not to burn the paint on the panels, which I do intend to keep as it is. So I didn't run the welds all the way into the corner here, but this is plenty strong as it is. I'm doing some more alignment here, and now I need to prepare some material for the shelf. And I'm once again using this coated plywood I use for a lot of things. This seems to be rare outside of Germany, and the only English term I heard for it that seems to be accurate is phenolic film coated plywood. It's a high-grade birch plywood that's coated with a super durable waterproof surface and usually comes with a smooth side and a rough side. People mostly use this material for high wear applications like truck beds, but they also work great for shop furniture or even office furniture if you're a pragmatist like me. The only piece I had left of this has a few small screw holes on the bottom, unfortunately, but they're not going to be visible later, so it's not a big deal for me. This board now fits in here like this. And as I mentioned earlier, the desk will have integrated lighting again, but instead of attaching an LED channel to the bottom of the board, this time it will actually be even more fancy, because this channel here is designed to be inset into the wood. So it's going to be almost flush with the surface, and for that I have to now cut a channel into the board, which I've already marked out here. I'm using the router with an edge attachment for this. As I mentioned many times before, I'm not much of a woodworker, so the idea of using a handheld milling machine still seems kind of insane to me, because it's so easy to mess up your parts with these if you're not careful, but except for one or two small blemishes, this came out pretty okay. The LED channel now fits in there nicely, and next I'm going to add some tabs to the frame that will hold the board. I'm clamping these down with the board in between, and that way I can make sure that everything on the top surface is going to be flush. Last time I used some sacrificial wood for this, but since these will just be tack welded, I'm not too worried about burning the plywood. And just like with the back panels, a few good tack welds are more than enough to hold the static weight, so there's no need to over weld this. I'm also adding a few tack welds on the inside, and then once again I'm correcting the angle a little bit. We're almost done with the welding on this now. There's only one thing missing, which is a lid in the back. That will make it possible to easily pass cables and power strips to the cable tray. I want to attach the lid using these hinges, but I need to shorten them on one side to get them closer to the edge, so I'll just use the grinder for that. Now that the lid is all prepared, there's just a few preparations to do for the electrical part before I can finally paint the frame and then finish it. So first the LED channels get cut to size and drilled for mounting holes, and now I can screw those into the channel here and also cut the LED strip to length. I'm now drilling one last hole, which is at the end of the channel, and that's where the cable is going to come out and attach to the strip inside the board. And finally, to turn the LEDs on and off, I want to use this fancy switch here and integrate it into the end of the tubing. But before I can install all that, I need to first paint the frame. Like I mentioned, I want to keep the paint on the panels, so I'm masking that off here. I know it's kind of a waste of tape here, but I couldn't be bothered to find a big piece of cardboard. I did lightly sand the frame and degreased everything before painting, but ideally you would first use primer for painting on bare metal. I forgot to buy it and want to get this done, so I'm painting directly on the steel here, but I feel like I should mention it's not ideal to do it this way. Now we can finally move on to the finishing steps. For the open ends, I 3D printed some plugs. You can also buy these things, but except for this one, the others are kind of custom, so that's why I made them myself. The plug for the other side has a hole in it, which you guessed it, is for the switch I showed you. The switch normally has a nut in the back to secure it, but that doesn't fit inside the tubing, so instead I just printed this hole slightly undersized and figured I can just press the switch in there, and that turned out to work perfectly because it sits in there super tight. I'm now attaching the actual power cable to the steel wire here and carefully pulling it through the frame. And now there's some soldering to be done. The switch actually has its own little light, so I had to split this cable here. So 2 of these cables are for the LED strip and 2 are for the built-in light in the switch. And now I can install the plug with some careful taps with the rubber mallet. I'm actually not sure if I could ever get it out of there again without destroying something, so I really hope I won't have any issues with the wiring. I can now attach the LED strip and stick that into its channel. And then these clear covers just pop in there. Of course, there's tons of other lighting solutions you could integrate here, but I like this particular combination with those aluminum channels and the strips because it's really cheap, and just having a few of those channels and a roll of LED strip around allows me to quickly build custom lighting solutions, which is why I use this stuff all over my shop. Now we just need a plug here, and then let's connect it and give it a try. The button lights up and the LED strip also works, so I can now screw down the shelf. And the very last step is to also add plugs to the tubes on the bottom. Again, these are custom, and in case you want to print these yourself, I'm including the STL files for those in the plans. And with that, the shelf unit is now finished and ready to install. But before we do that, the other major thing I wanted to add to the desk is a huge drawer underneath the tabletop. You can buy Underdesk drawers, and I'm sure they're great, but I wanted to utilize as much of the usable area under the desk as possible. And even the widest ones I found were too short or too shallow for what I wanted. And I want to store a lot of stuff in there, so that's why I decided to make my own. The frame of the drawer will be made up from some aluminum angle extrusion. You could also use steel for this, but I didn't want to make it too heavy and actually happen to have a bunch of this stuff in the shop anyway. The pieces will all get miters, and I actually decided to cut them off straight because cutting miters on an L-shaped piece can be a little tricky with this kind of saw because of how you have to flip and clamp the pieces in order to get a trapezoid. So instead, I'm just going to make the miters on the grinder by setting up the stop here to 45 degrees. And then I can just push the pieces in like this, and I end up with a perfect 45-degree angle. And this shot here is in real time, so you can see it really only takes a few seconds. And by the way, if you're interested in this belt grinder, I made a bunch of videos about how I built it, and there's also plans available for this. I'm making another little fixture now to tag this up. Like I mentioned earlier, I prefer to do the outside corner joints horizontally, so I'm actually going to weld this up in the vise. As nice as these look, I will once again have to grind the welds down though. You're not really going to see them either way, but I need the edges to be flat to mount the drawer slides. I also need some kind of board for the bottom of the drawer, and I'm cutting this with a track saw because there's not a single straight edge on this piece of material, and that's because this is actually part of the shipping box that my welding table came in. Wood has gotten crazy expensive in recent years, and I'm a cheapskate, so I figured I'll just keep it around because while it's the cheapest plywood imaginable, it totally works for this application. This fits in the finished frame nicely, so next is to figure out how to attach the slides. So the idea is to sandwich these between the frame and another piece of angle bracket, which will also be what holds the whole thing to the bottom of the tabletop. And then in front I want to add this additional strip of aluminum as a cover, so the slides will be completely hidden, and I think it's going to look really neat, even though you won't really see it down there. I need to get rid of this gap here though, and for that I need to shorten the bracket. It would of course be easier to just buy a bracket with the right dimensions, but I used what I had, so these are going on the mill to remove a few millimeters from the short side. Now I can transfer and drill all the mounting holes. This is just a test install right now to see if everything works, and it looks like it's working great. So now I'm going to attach this strip in front, and while I'm usually not a fan of gluing things, I decided to stick this on with some high-strength double-sided tape because it's just the most straightforward solution in this case, and I know this stuff sticks like hell. Now I'm going to align this to the desk here and figure out where I need to pre-drill, and of course I marked my drill so I don't drill too deep because this is not a thick tabletop and I don't want to come out of the other side. It's almost ready to install now. I'm just adding 2 holes in front for a handle, and then this also gets painted black. Installing these slides for the first time is always a bit finicky, but it looks like everything worked out, and I'm quite happy with the fit and finish here. It closes smoothly with almost no visible gap, and most of all I think with the paint, the drawer blends in so well with the rest of the desk that it almost looks like I bought it this way. I can now finally install the shelf unit to the desk, but it turned out to be pretty tricky because it goes on from the bottom and it's pretty heavy. So I put the table on the edge of the workbench here with a weight in the back so that I can install it upside down. I think ideally you would just have 2 people for this, which I imagine would make it a lot easier. The next challenge was to actually get this off the workbench, because the FlexiSpot frame is pretty heavy duty and it weighs a lot, which is a good thing, but with the shelf also installed, I ended up actually removing the legs, which are the heaviest parts, and this makes it a lot lighter and less unwieldy, so I could then carefully drop it onto some packing foam, so I don't scratch up the paint, and then I could just reinstall the legs and put it upright. So here's the more or less finished desk. I'm just adding a handle to the drawer now, and then we can start installing stuff. I'm going to start with mounting the monitor, and while you can attach one to the back panel, I actually designed this specifically so that it should work with most tabletop mounted monitor arms. So as you can see, there's enough clearance everywhere to easily mount this thing, and this just gives you a lot more flexibility to choose the kind of mounting solution you want. Next is installing the PC, and this is a bit of a special case here because my workshop computer is actually this. This is an Intel NUC, which is basically just a tiny PC, and I'm sure the gamer kiddies will make fun of me for this, but since this is my workshop computer, this thing just does everything I need. It's powerful enough for doing some CAD work and general web browsing, which is mostly what I do here, and this form factor is just incredibly convenient for a more minimal setup. These things are actually designed to be mounted to the back of a monitor, which is how I used it in my old setup. But to my surprise, the mounting plate happens to match the hole pattern on the pegboards, so it seemed like kind of a no-brainer to just attach it there. Besides the fact that it neatly tucks away behind the monitor, I also like that I have all the connections on this side, so I can reach 4 USB slots and the card reader that's built into the monitor from here, as well as the power button. After doing some cable management there, I can now install the cable tray that comes with the desk and plug everything in. And I gotta say, I was surprised how well this works. On a normal desk, this kind of tray isn't the greatest solution in my opinion, which is why I went out of my way to come up with something different from my last build. But besides the tray being a decent size here, the fact that this is a standing desk just makes the whole cable management part of it so much easier. Because you can just put the desk into its tallest setting, and then you can do all the wiring standing up when stuff is easy to reach. So here's the desk with all the tech installed, and it looks nice and clean with only a single cable coming down there right now, which I'm also gonna hide in a second. Now I can put the lid back on here. It just needs a tiny modification because it doesn't want to stay down. So like last time, I'm drilling a shallow hole in the side here that's slightly undersized for this magnet, and then I'm just hammering that in with a plastic hammer. And the magnet provides just enough resistance to keep the lid down while still being easy to flip it back. This lid now visually closes the gap in the back here, but it's still super easy to push things like plugs or power strips down here while allowing clearance for the cable itself. As I mentioned, for my application, I consider this desk to be a workbench to some degree. So instead of getting one of the usual desk mats, I got this huge cutting mat because it actually works well as a desk mat, but it's also designed to take a beating. This one has two sides, and I specifically got this because I think the black side also looks really cool in the overall setup. So here's what this all looks like with just a minimal clean PC setup. And as nice as that is, I'm going to turn it into a workstation now. So the Pegboards came with some of these accessories here, which I think are mostly kind of useless, but these big boxes actually work well for storing some frequently used electronic supplies. I then printed this headphone holder. This just attaches with 2 screws and nuts from the back, and that way I can also utilize the space behind the monitor to some degree. The next thing I wanted to store is these electrical pliers, and at first I was just gonna make a rail, but I actually have a pliers rail somewhere else in the shop. And the thing is that electronics pliers can have some pretty weird shapes. For example, this one just doesn't want to stay on there no matter which way I put it. So I thought about other ways of storing pliers that work for a variety of shapes, while also making them very easy to retrieve and put back. And eventually I came up with this design that I'm printing here. I'm not sure if this is even a new idea, but I don't think I've seen this before. This basically has a channel that's angled forward, and you just stick the end of the handle in, and they kind of wedge themselves in there thanks to gravity. This turns out to work well even for odd-shaped pliers or anything with a weird weight distribution, and it also works well for different sizes. That being said, this is a bit of a beta version, and I already thought of a bunch of stuff I want to improve about it. And I could maybe even see offering this as some kind of product if enough people want it, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. Another thing I want to integrate into the desk is this soldering station, but I don't want it to take up any desk space, so the idea is to make some kind of shelf for it, so it can sort of float there. But I actually don't have to make it, because my printer will do it for me. You probably noticed I'm getting more and more into 3D printing here, and one big reason for that is that I got a new printer. This is the X1 Carbon from Bamboo Lab, which is their flagship model, and coming from a 5-year-old entry-level printer, I'm just blown away by how good these things have gotten. The quality, reliability, and most importantly the speed at which this churns out prints is really a game changer for me. I'm gonna link this in the description along with a lot of other stuff I used in this build if you're interested. So here's the finished shelf now. It has built-in clearance for the cable, it fits the soldering station like a glove, and I also think it looks pretty good. From the position it's in now, I can reach most of the table with both the soldering iron and the hot air gun, but if I need this closer for any reason, it's also very easy to just lift the whole thing out of the shelf and put it somewhere else. Next thing I want to integrate is my phone charger, so I just changed the design from the shelf you just saw a little bit, and the charger fits in there perfectly, and making it relatively long both creates clearance for the plug and also makes the phone easier to reach. Last but not least, let's make use of that drawer now. To organize it, I printed a whole bunch of sorting boxes, which are based on the Gridfinity system. Gridfinity is kind of an open source framework for printing organization systems for pretty much anything you can think of, and as the name says, it's all based on a grid system. I'm mostly using it for these fairly basic bins here, but you can do a lot more with it, and I'm gonna link a video from Zach Friedman down below. He's the guy who came up with this, and even if you don't care about Gridfinity, it's actually worth watching it just for his jokes. For this one, my old printer actually came in handy because it does have a much bigger print bed compared to the X1, so I printed the grids on that one. But I also printed some bins on it, and in this comparison you can really see the difference in quality. Once I had all the boxes, I started with the tedious task of transferring countless tiny parts from the cheapo divider bins that came in to the printed bins, which took way longer than I'd like to admit. So Gridfinity is based on a 42mm grid, and you can customize it and make your grid bigger or smaller, but I would suggest to stick with the standard size because there's a huge amount of 3D models for this to be found online, and most of them use the standard grid. So for my case, I just made the last row of grids with a spacer in the back so that everything fits in there neatly. I lose about 10mm of space this way, but it's not really a big deal. Now I can place all my boxes in there, which feels a little bit like playing Tetris, and it's oddly satisfying to play around with different layouts. And the boxes are designed so that they're also stackable, so if you print two half-size ones, you can put them on top of each other to double the space. I'll probably keep moving things around in there to suit my needs, but for now I'm pretty happy with this. There's just one tiny last thing I felt like improving now, and that's the cable from the power strip that's just sort of dangling sideways there. So I bought this spiral extension cord and just zip tied one end to the bottom of the tabletop and the other end to this magnet with a little hook on it. And now I can just stick that to the foot of the desk and plug it in, and that way I have one clean looking cable that powers the entire setup and is able to extend and shrink as the desk moves up and down. We are finally done now. So here's the finished desk. I still moved a few things around here and there, but overall I'm very happy with the setup. I used to think I don't need a standing desk before I had this, but I quickly found out that especially here in the shop, it's super useful to be able to have the desk at standing height, so I can easily check something in between working on other things and then being able to sit down for stuff that takes longer. The added weight is not a problem at all for this desk either. This is the E7 Pro, and FlexiSpot says it's able to lift up to 440 pounds, so it doesn't even flinch trying to lift any of this. The base is also really stable, so it's great to have this dedicated spot for more intricate tasks now. To get your own FlexiSpot desk, just click the link in the description where you can also find 2 discount codes to save some extra money. I hope you enjoyed this build, and there's a good chance it's not the last desk you've seen on this channel, so I'd be interested to hear what other features you would like to see in future desk builds. So feel free to leave a comment, and as always, thanks for watching.